Perfect. Hi there. So we're joined today with Julie Snow, and we are going to be discussing all things netball, physiotherapy, helping physiotherapists, aspiring sports therapists to how they can get into professional sport. So Julie is currently England netball physiotherapist. So it's some exciting times coming up with Commonwealth next year. And yeah, it'd be great just to initially just hear your overview of your career, where it started out, Julie, and of course where you are now with obviously at England netball.
Sure. So I started out firstly working for the NHS, but supporting my hometown local club that my family had always been involved in rugby, whilst I was training and whilst I first started out as a physio for the NHS. And that led me to meet quite a few people and get to know a few people in rugby circles. And when an opportunity came, I switched out of the NHS and joined professional rugby full time. And I stayed in men's 15s rugby for, I think about 12 seasons, and then switched to the sevens programme for the women and the men for a period of time, and then came over to netball in 2018, late 2018. So 3 years with the netball now, and as you say, going into our Commonwealth and World Cup cycles.
Yeah, and so actually drawing back to, you mentioned working in the amateur clubs and obviously being involved in rugby. From sort of, when did you start thinking, or want to go into physiotherapy specifically?
Yeah, so I was always quite keen on my sport myself, as was my father. So we were always in and around different sports. I played netball myself, actually. And my first introduction to physiotherapy was I hurt myself and popped along to see the physio that had been working with the rugby club for some advice. And it kind of dawned on me over the next few weeks that I probably wasn't going to be skillful enough to play for England myself in any kind of sport. And it was around the same time as I had to make some decisions at school about what I wanted to do course-wise and where I might apply for university. And I just thought, oh, this is quite cool, isn't it? You get to hang out with different sports teams. And that's what drew me into looking into physiotherapy. And then I realised it was actually much broader than just being in the sporting world. And I really enjoyed all those aspects as well. And yeah, so that's what took me off to go and study it. I always thought I had a preference for sports, but I did enjoy all my wider training as well. So kind of naturally just found my way back into those sporting arenas.
Yeah, and I think that's what probably a lot of people go into physiotherapy, definitely sports therapy to work in sport. But you said there that you had your NHS placements, and actually you found that was quite fulfilling, and you actually could have gone down that route as well. So I suppose briefly touch upon it. What made that exciting and sort of made you think actually go down that route rather than the sports, which has always been a part of your life?
Yeah, so the sport element, I guess, is the musculoskeletal element of physiotherapy, and it's one of the core teachings, but it's only a small element, and it ends up being quite niche. And I think it's definitely the one that the world knows the most of. If you talk to people about physiotherapists, they just assume it's the person on the sideline of a sporting event, and helping with injuries and bags of ice and things like that. But there's so much more to it, and I think my experience with the NHS really opened my eyes to that, and I really enjoyed those environments and the different ways physios can help and support people in all kinds of different ailments and issues, much further beyond musculoskeletal, and some certainly very brainy physios out there that work with some really challenging medical situations that I totally respect and would definitely bow down to in this day and age. But yeah, I ended up focusing in on a musculoskeletal path. So although I was in the NHS, I had a musculoskeletal role in my role in the NHS. So I kind of became quite specialised in that almost straight away. And then it became even more specialised when I went into sports injuries, I guess. And now one difference between rugby and netball would be that it's almost specialised again with the types of injuries that we see. So
yeah, definitely. So then going into rugby, like say you did 12 seasons, you worked Worcester and Jersey, if that's right, and which for people who don't know a lot about rugby, played within the league, so Jersey Championship, Worcester Premiership, but then you also move to the sevens, which is a slightly different, which is more of a circuit based. So
Yes.
like we discussed before, this is probably similar to netball, but just give us a bit of an overview of what it was like working within professional rugby. Start with the club stuff, and then maybe how that then differed into the seven circuit and the challenges and the opportunity you had within that.
Definitely. So particularly in the men's side of rugby, they've been professional for quite a long time now, and that's kind of filtered down certainly through the top two tiers, and is continuing to filter down, which means naturally clubs have got more incentive to build their infrastructures and have the support staff around the players to look after their squads, because there's more incentive to train them, to look after them, to get the performances because of the financial implications more than anything. So being in rugby for those 12 years, certainly in the top tier teams that I work with, there were teams of 4 or 5 physios working with the senior players through to the academies, and big support staff teams around all these players. Still several members of staff in the championship level, which is the second tier. But some teams within that not quite as lucky and might only have one physiotherapist. So 2 of the teams that I work for in their championship eras, it was just myself, unless we brought someone in part-time to help me or voluntarily to help me. So quite a difference already just in those 2 teams as to whether you were a lone wolf or whether you work within a multidisciplinary team with a handful of therapists doing the best to juggle all the numbers in the squads. But going into the sevens, again, that's probably more likely it's just you and your squad, but the squad is much, much smaller in a 7 squad. So easier to manage with just the one pair of hands, but the demands of the sport are different, and the travel and the time away and packing your kit bag becomes really important, making sure you don't forget something when you're touring around the world. And in all of that, you'd have relationships with the players themselves, with the coaches, with the S&C staff that tended to come with you, or communicating with them back home, and the management strategies of looking after injured players versus the ones that needed to get out playing week in, week out, managing little things through the week, but still being able to play. So that's pretty full on in the rugby world. It was definitely well established in those environments. And then switching across to the netball or women's rugby, it's probably not been professional as many years in either aspect or either sport, and therefore the infrastructures and the teams tend to be a bit smaller and just are still developing in depth, really. So you tend to be, again, just sort of one person in your discipline trying to do the best by the team and the athletes, and trying to encourage other teams to do the same and develop and grow in the same way, in the hope that they'll aspire to be as fully professional and integrated as some of the men's sports.
Yeah, definitely. And then so moving into your current role at the minute, then with the Vitality Roses, so just for people who may not know about the netball side of things or role, just do you want to give a bit of overview of what you currently do and how you work with the athletes?
So the Vitality Roses netball contracts are camp based, and they contracted the players all year round, but the international window is from start of August all the way through to the end of January, and that's when we tend to play up to 3 test series against the top ranking nations, depending on how we can coordinate the schedules. So we often end up playing teams like Australia, New Zealand, Jamaica, South Africa as our main competition through those periods of time. And then for the other half of the year, our Roses players go out to their clubs and play in the domestic league and compete at home week in, week out for their clubs. So they have a period of consistent weekly netball, and then they have a period where it's more camp based and sort of test series, quite intense training camps leading into competition games.
Cool. So I suppose with that brings sort of challenges in the sense of seeing athletes for short periods of time, then going to the clubs and being dispersed. Obviously the clubs range from up to Manchester, Leeds to down in Wales and London. So sort of a lot of miles on the car. So kind of what are the sort of, I suppose, challenges that you would face that you have to deal with working in this environment, and how do you go about sort of overcoming those ones?
Yeah, so as you say, when they're out with their clubs, there's a lot of touring around to go and see people and continue to support them, as some of our squad players. We've adapted a little bit in this era with a few more video calls to check in and maybe not have to spend so much time in the car. But it's good for us to stay in touch with them when they're with their clubs, to help communicate with their coaching staff, with other members of their MDTs, with their physios that perhaps aren't full-time, and we can help facilitate sessions through the week and then sort of give them a bit of feedback as to whether or not they're going to be able to be involved at the weekends, things like that. And then also it just helps us build into what is our training camps. So we know where they're at, we know how hard we can push them, we know what they've been carrying for the last few weeks or months if they've been coming back from something, which then just means that we can plan much more appropriately when they're coming into our sessions and our competition phases.
Yeah, and just going back to, you mentioned about just being there on your own. Mm-hmm. And in rugby, you have the sort of medical team, and you've got soft tissue therapists there, and a team of medical professionals. Mm-hmm. At this moment, with England Netball, so you'll have yourself and a couple of part-time, and then obviously you've got the club medical team as well. Yeah. But obviously there's less resource there. So how important is it that players can educate themselves, or you can help educate players to look after the recovery, and sort of what are the things that you sort of go through with them to sort of help, I suppose, subsidize the lack of team resource that you would have?
Yeah, a lot of it is education and advice, and asking the players to take care of themselves to a certain extent, in that we try and provide as many options and facilities that we can do in order for them to be able to do that. So supporting them with access to the pool, for instance, as a way of recovery, or if they need to go and do a slightly modified running session or jump work without hurting their knees or ankles further, as an example. We try and make sure we can facilitate gym access wherever we might be, so that they can go and do the types of loading sessions that they might need to do, or strength work that they might need to do. We are fortunate enough that we can access different hub sites across the way, and again, it's just encouraging the players to communicate with us when they feel they need something, to assess and establish what it is that we can do to help them. And a lot of it is often education and advice, and asking them to go away and work on a few things, rather than always being on the physio bed, having something manipulated or moved around or strapped, and then we all sort of come together as a bit of a collaborative plan, with very much the athlete being the centerpiece in that, and how best to make the most out of their week, shall we say. But yeah, it's a big part of communication when it's just yourself and maybe one S&C, a doctor, nutritionist, working collaboratively to try and put that plan together. But really it's down to the athletes to understand it, buy into it, and action it, really, because they're the ones that have got control of their own bodies for 24 hours a day.
Yeah, definitely. And I think some of the key points you mentioned there, especially communication and trust, is I suppose a few layers to that. But just how do you then, in terms of communication, so what does that actually look like in terms of with athletes? Is that with the sort of Rose's camp players, let's say out of camp, it's weekly calls? Is it once a month for text? What does that actually look like?
So I think when you work with the same team pretty consistently, you kind of get a family vibe. So there's a lot of WhatsApps and a lot of groups, and sometimes quite a spontaneous conversation will start, via an Instagram reaction. So I'd certainly say it's evolved in the last few years with the likes of social media, and it's so easy to be in touch with people these days, rather than having to wait for a face-to-face contact point. But yeah, I mean, we always go back to video calls, face-to-face consultations, and formal communication in that sense. But yeah, when it's a bit of a family, it's a bit of a group ethos, so it's quite, text messages come in at all kinds of hours, and it's just whether or not you get the blue ticks on the WhatsApp to see if they're going to respond.
And that's a very a new problem, isn't it? Now the blue ticks and
Yeah.
yeah, I think it used to be the days where if you leave them voicemail, they'd have their voicemail full, so you couldn't leave them a message and
Yeah.
stuff. So new problems. And then so just on that then, with the communication and the family vibe, which is a hugely important thing and a key element to gaining trust, and I suppose comes with that is honesty. So
Yeah.
in previous webinars and conversations we've had with athletes is the Commonwealth, for example, next year, one of the players has got a slight injury. Would they have the trust and confidence to tell them, or some people hide it to go, I don't want to, present this injury because it could affect my chances to play on the world stage and obviously the World Cup as well. So I suppose, how do you strike that balance of having that confidence? Obviously, you've got a duty of care and making sure player welfare is at the forefront of everyone's mind, but how do you deal with those sort of situations? So, and does it come down to understanding the players more and building that relationship, or what do you kind of do to make sure that you're getting them to give you the sort of trust you were giving them the information that you wouldn't go, oh, they can't play, and then you can foresee some other challenges coming from there?
Yeah, it's definitely about how you build in relationships and working with people as the main thing, rather than simply working with a knee or simply working with a certain injury or simply working with the fact that you've got to cover 4 sessions as such. You have personal interactions and involvements both with the athletes themselves and then the coaching staff as well. And it needs to be honest and it needs to be open and collaborative, because they are going to put their trust in you to help them and to get them better, whether it's actually from a point of injury or just generally to develop athletically anyway and avoid injuries, ideally. And within the netball environment, we try and be quite open and share information with the groups so that we can build those trust elements. We have lots of one-to-one interactions, and then we also have collaborative meetings where athletes and then the various support staff around them to talk through certain situations if need be. There's a lot of welfare support involved in that as well to make sure people feel like they can ask questions, even if it's not necessarily to the person directly. There should be some kind of outlet so that stuff can be expressed and discussed. And again, I think quite important to have a no blame culture as well, alongside your honesty in that it's no one's fault. No one goes out there to try and pick up injuries or to say it'll be a week and then it's actually 10 days. Everyone's trying to do their best to establish a good outcome. But that doesn't always mean it goes to plan, and it doesn't always mean it works. So I think if you've built those relationships, you can have those honest conversations to be able to say, I think I'm planning this. I think that it will go this way, but it could end up being a little bit longer, or it could end up being a little bit quicker. But if you keep talking to me on how you're feeling, I'll be able to accelerate it, or we might have to slow it down. And then the trust element comes in as to them giving you that appropriate feedback on what they're feeling and what they're going through. And I think over time, most athletes learn that it's to their benefit to share those things, and actually sort of keeping things doesn't necessarily work in their favor. But when you have that family vibe and you get used to people's mannerisms and the way they move and how they go about themselves in training, normally someone tends to pick up on it if something isn't quite right. So it's not an easy place to hide when you're in each other's pockets a lot of the time. So
yeah. And sort of on the other side of that is you've got obviously the athlete that wants to come back and or sometimes could be saying, actually, I don't want to play and have an injury that there's but then the other side of that is you've got the coaches. So in any of the sports you've worked in or any of the clubs, there'll be big pivotal moments within the seasons where they want their best player back and he may be carrying an injury. And how do you go about managing that relationship as well? Because for sort of healthcare practitioners here, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place sometimes, I presume, because you've got the coach wanting the player back and then the player sometimes wanting to come back or not wanting to come back, and you're trying to manage them both. So sort of what have you done in the past or in current sort of role that sort of helps facilitate that, or the key things you've got to do to help that?
I think it's quite tricky in the rugby environments because that's a weekly competitive game. And that puts an added pressure on that question of how many weeks are they out, and when are they back, when can I have them back, because there's so many competition moments, and everyone feels precious, I think, in those times. Whereas in netball we have a few more sort of blocks and chunks of time, which means you can generally rule in or rule out something fairly early on just from the overall time frame. So the week on week can be trickier, and yeah, every coach loves that question of how many weeks are they out for, and I guess you don't want to set your stall out too ambitiously and set yourself up to fail. So I think having experience and being realistic of the time frames around you, but then also again having that honesty with the coach of, if everything goes well and they're hitting all their objective markers, we're looking at this type of time frame. If we hit a few stumbling blocks, it's going to be more around this time. So they'll only ever hear the good one and the short one. But if you can definitely lay it out from the beginning that there is perhaps a potential plan B, or where the sticking points might be, that always goes down reasonably well, because then they tend to be like, how did it go? Has it gone well? Like, have they met that marker? Is there anything I can do to help encourage them to try harder, type thing? So again, sort of, you don't want to set yourself up to fail or set the athlete up to fail by being over ambitious and sort of saying something that normally takes 2 months will be 4 weeks easy. Because that very rarely is the case. Sometimes it's great, but quite often and again, you've got an athlete at the heart of that has to buy into wanting to push harder and come back and accelerate things, and wanting to do more. And if it's medically and clinically appropriate to do so, then brilliant. But sometimes the way tissues behave and the way injuries behave, you just have to allow it a little bit of time and a bit of respect, because a lot of these things are, particularly in rugby, are quite big insults to the body, and they have to calm back down and settle down. And even though it feels great today, it might not feel great tomorrow, and we can't just assume that you can go back out there. So I think communication is the key, and it's a buzzword that gets thrown around. But again, the more you can be open and honest and set out some targets and explain to both athletes and coaches what the scenarios could be, it ends up being more of a collaborative effort to achieve the best outcome. But then there's also a shared understanding that you've done your best if that doesn't end up being the outcome. You've all tried to get it there, but there's just been a little bit of an obstacle or a hurdle in the way that means you've had to add an extra week on, for example. It's when people get blindsided by things that they don't expect, that's when those relationships break down. So again, just that communication and honesty, really.
Yeah, and I think it's really important and clear, is in the communication, like you say, is sort of a buzzword, but what does that actually look like? And because you could communicate, oh, it's going to be 6 weeks, but not communicate but if we hit these benchmarkers, and also explain that to them in layman's terms, because people, I think, and realize actually how much physios know, and actually the coaches will know 10% of that. So just to be really clear, and I love the point of making it collaborative. So if to get the buy-in from them, if you want the player back in 6 or 8 weeks, then he needs to be doing this, this, and this, and then it's great. Rather than you probably experienced, coach goes, how many weeks? Somebody could say 6 weeks, gets to 6 weeks. Where is he? He's not ready.
Yeah, he's not ready. Yeah, exactly. I think there's two issues in that conversation as well. Is surgeons, they're really unhelpful. They love to put a time frame on things just based on the fact that when it might have healed. Because they just do the front bit. They do the surgery and then they go, that's my work done, I'm brilliant. Actually, the whole getting back out into the sport is down to the therapists and the conditioners and the coaches that work with those athletes. But they're great at chucking out a time frame that perhaps isn't necessarily sport related, which isn't always helpful. And then the coaches as well, they're notorious for, I had one of them and it was only 3 weeks. And you kind of want to go, you do realize you walk with a limp at 45, like maybe you should have taken a bit longer. But there's that history of I've known someone that's had that. It didn't take that long. Why is it going to take so long? So those two things can't always be helpful. But being able to
No.
talk through that rationally helps.
Yeah, and I think also at this Alan Jones coming back within 3 weeks, probably set a new benchmark for a lot of people.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, again, in a little bit of context, one would assume, given his age and where he's at in his career, he probably had a moment of let's just go for it.
Yeah,
I'm sure there's many a physio around the world that's just gone, oh, brilliant, thanks.
yeah.
You've made that really tricky for us.
Yeah, but that is a good point. Like you mentioned at the start, is knowing the person. Is in you're not just treating the injury. It's not just the shoulder.
No,
it's a person that has a shoulder injury. So understand where they are with their career, who they are, what the motivations are, and then do the same with the coaches, and you can usually get some better buy-in. So, you're right. I think a few people will go 3 weeks.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Alan.
It's a good way. He got through it, didn't he?
He did. Brilliant. Again, that really didn't help either, did it? Well done to him and his medical team and all those that work with him. It was a really good, really good outcome for him.
Yeah. And so we talked about a bit of player education earlier. So, so do you guys have a sort of protocols of how you can help athletes? So probably talking a bit more netball now. So you set out their benchmarks and you set out what they need to be doing. If it's injury specific. So how much time do you have sort of spending to sort of educate players to get them to really sort of buy into that?
The question cut out a little bit, so let me just
double
check the question. It was how much time we have to actually sort of educate the players and to buy into the process.
And exactly, and then sort of how does the sort of moving forward with the growth of netball and women's sport as a whole as well, there may be elements of more medical teams come in, but do you guys see it as a strategy moving forward, and probably should be replicated across other sports, of player education, and that's the key to get them to buy into everything? Or is it a case of you just want more medical team to help out?
No, there's definitely a big education piece, probably across all sports, but certainly in netball, we have our pathway system and our development frameworks, and the more information we can get out to people at younger ages. Netball's a sport that girls play from very young school age, really, and the traditional view, I suppose, of netball and to get good at netball is to just play more netball. And what we've kind of learned is that there needs to be a little bit more athletic development with that, which it's a bit taboo, but it's not necessarily encouraged amongst female population and through teenage years. And there's a bit of a stigma of girls getting in the gym and trying to develop some strength and some coordinations and skill sets that they perhaps don't necessarily see the link with what goes on the court. And then as they come more into higher level sports and elite programs, they realize that it does translate into the skills that they're trying to demonstrate out on the court and how athletic they can be. So the younger we can get them involved in those types of activities, the better, really, and start that education piece, which will not only make them better and more skilled athletes out there, but it will also help them with their robustness and injury prevention. Because there are some real sort of fundamental and foundation skills that a lot of women playing netball perhaps have never really focused in on and never really touched on, and they can end up leading to injury situations. Whereas if they'd started to learn some of those skill sets at a younger age in school or with their club teams as part of their warm-ups, I mean, even doing a warm-up isn't necessarily something that's done that often, or even just seeking advice, really. So in those moments when you do have aches and pains, not just shoving the bag of peas on it one night and then rocking back out for training again the next week because it feels all right again. So there's definitely a lot of education things to be delivered, to be shared, to be encouraged. We have those frameworks where we try and roll it out. We do road shows. We try and get in the team's ears and the coach's ears, and coach education and parent education. And there's lots of different aspects and levels, and doing stuff like this, sharing information on webinars and as much as we can, really, just because it's all about growing the sport, growing female athletes, encouraging people to look after themselves and get to their full potential, really.
Yeah, brilliant. And I'm just conscious of time, so we'll finish on the last question, which we ask all of our guests that come on to our webinars. But so if you had advice for maybe your younger self or anybody who's aspiring to work within professional sport, what advice would you give them?
I would say don't limit yourself to one sport too early. But if you are involved in a sport, like really get to know that sport, whether you've played it or you don't quite understand the rules. So get to know those rules, because that'll help when you're working with the athletes. It'll reassure them and give them confidence if you can sound out some of the things. As an example, if you can understand how a prop gets into the position for a scrummage, that might help him or her believe that you're going to help them well with their rehab period as such, if you understand what they're trying to get back to. So yeah, get to know your sport that you are aspiring to work in. If you aren't in a sport, don't try and limit yourself to one. Be open to going and spending time with other sports, other physios, volunteering, hanging out on the sidelines. There seems to be a lot of sacrifice in working in sport, in that you have to give up your weekends or your evenings, and there seems to be this perception of you have to start at the bottom and work your way up, and it's who you know and what not what you know and things like that. But just get out there, meet those people. You never know, you might get on with someone really well, or you might love a sport a lot more, in which case you want to invest more time in it yourself. But you do have to give up time, so make sure it is something that you definitely do enjoy. Hanging out and watching, and working with those athletes. So yeah, I think that would probably be my top tip, would be to understand whatever sport it is that you're getting involved in, so that you can contribute better to your rehab plans further down the line, and just take the opportunities to get to know people, ask what people are doing in their disciplines, if there's anything that where they feel the holes are, or if a physio can help or a therapist can help, and why, and can you help with that? That would always be the way in then. And yeah, get to know people in different teams.
Brilliant, sound advice. I like that. Cool. Okay, thank you very much, Julie.
You're welcome.
Cheers. I'll edit this bit out, so I don't know how to stop recording.
Yeah, just stop recording.
I know. What is this? How to stop? Oh, there we go. Pause. Stop.